Hello everyone, welcome to my patch 14.24 mid lane tier list. There are definitely some big changes since the last one I made, so we have a fair amount to talk about, and the biggest one, of course, is the Viktor rework, which you can see I have him at the very top of S tier. So we'll start off just by talking about the Viktor rework. So Viktor previously, I think, was a pretty good champ, but he was definitely overshadowed by Syndra in that they had a very similar identity, but Syndra kind of just did it better. Syndra had a gang set up and had the ability to skirmish early, and the only real things that Viktor kind of had for those trade-offs was that he scaled slightly better than Syndra and he was slightly better in lane than Syndra, but for lacking gang setup and lacking any form of skirmishing power, it was basically just not worth it. So with the Viktor rework, I was really looking for some kind of power neutral change, but an identity shift just to give him, something to be worth picking over other champions in that specific spot. He has definitely done that, and they also gave him a massive power buff. So if we scroll down to wherever Viktor is, you can see that he got buffs to literally every single ability. So what does this mean? The passive changes means that he scales faster and more reliably. The Q change means he is even stronger in lane than he was before, and Viktor was already an insane lane bully, like probably the strongest mage in laning. Now he's even better. The W changes are pretty good. They make the W a little more consistent, and I would say this is probably it's the change with the most what's the word, like inconsistency, I guess, in its power return. Sometimes this is quite a good change, sometimes it doesn't really make a difference depending on what you're playing against. E-change, very, very good for the laning phase as well. And finally, the changes they did to ult means that he scales much, much better and just does like a lot more damage in the late game. So overall, like I said, I don't think Viktor actually needed buffs. He just needs some of the power shifted around. And with that, giant buffs to basically every ability, he's in a really, really good spot. So specifically, power changes aside, the niche Viktor has now is he's really good against laning against mages, and I think he's probably like the premier anti-mage that's good against tanks. So you have something like Talia that is like very good against tanks, but she has a bad lane into most mages, and you have something like Azir who is very good again into tanks, somewhat okay versus mages, but doesn't quite do as much damage as a Viktor unless you can free hit. But the problem with Azir is like, you do have to stand still in order to be autoing. So overall, I think Viktor, like I said, premier anti-mage, especially when you are against tanks. That being said, though, currently he is so OP that you could basically just pick him in any situation. I suspect he will be toned down next split, maybe directly or indirectly with item changes, but at least for now, he is very, very broken. And I think unless you're ultra high elo, he probably is just the best man in the game. The reason I say is the ultra high elo thing is I think potentially, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, I think maybe in Challenger that Aurora might be better than Viktor, and that's for a couple reasons, which I'll get into a bit later. But for basically all of you watching this video, I think Viktor is probably just the best and most consistent mid in the game in terms of what it provides. I also just wanted to give you guys a quick update on the mechanics tool I showed on my channel a few weeks ago. So when I made this video originally, you guys gave a lot of feedback, especially around the pricing model. They've made some really good changes in this area, so there are now several scenarios that you can just play completely for free, and also a lot of the paid memberships have been reduced, which I think is really, really good. If you weren't sure about it last time because of the price, I think now could be another time to take a second shot at it. Obviously, I can vouch for the quality, and personally, I'd never advertise something to you guys that I didn't think would be useful for your improvement. There will be a link in the description to this, which you can check out. And of course, if you have any more feedback, please put it in the comments section below, and I will make sure that it gets passed directly onto the Skillgap team. So that brings us to our second one then, which is Aurora. So I think in the previous tier list, I had Aurora somewhere in the A tier. I think Aurora is actually just S. So the changes to Aurora initially, I think, I was kind of thinking, okay, maybe power neutral, like her ult might be better in some situations, might be worse in others. I'd actually say the ult is overall better. It definitely is worse in some situations, but I think the ult overall just is stronger. And they made her even better in lane because they gave her more range on her Q and her E. And that puts Aurora in like a really weird spot where, like, if you look in Korean Challenger, a lot of people have these absurd win rates on Aurora. And the reason is that here's the thing, if you can blind Aurora, because like if you play into a melee, you just absolutely demolish them. Like melees are almost unplayable against Aurora unless you're playing like a couple of specific ones, mainly Akali and Sylas, which I'll get to later. But TLDR, Aurora just blasts melees. Also, she's a flex pick. She's very good in top lane. So if you lock in Aurora, it's difficult to counter because you don't know for sure if it's going mid or top until later in the draft. On top of that, the champs that do beat Aurora, the range champs, so you'll see stuff like, again, Ori or Viktor, or Syndra, Hui even, picked into Aurora. The problem with these is they're all very immobile, and the 75% slow from her ulti, if you drop this on an immobile mage at 6 and the jungler's there, they might die even with flash. you know, depending on how far they are up in the lane. And a lot of the time, you might be like, okay, well, they can just play safer. But if they're playing a bit too safe, they won't actually pressure you, and you're just getting away with your Aurora pick. And I've watched a lot of VODs of Korean solo queue of Auroras. And again, the matchup into stuff like Ori and Viktor is very hard, but you just kind of see at level 6, they ult, and then the Leona or the Xin or Jarvan or whatever just comes and kills the mage. So in some ways, I think that Aurora's power is, at least as a blind pick, tied to your jungle and support. I think if you're just using her as a counter pick, then you can play her into melees without any assistance at all. But you are somewhat reliant on your team for navigating some of those more difficult matchups. The thing I always say with this, though, is that, like, you know, some people will make the argument that, like, oh, maybe Aurora isn't good in lower elos because, like, you're not going to get, you know, help from your team in those difficult matchups. But chances are that if you're in a lower elo, those difficult matchups just aren't going to be as hard because the opponents just aren't going to be as good at it, right? So I would say Aurora is, yeah, really, really broken, and the flex pick potential is super nice as well. If you're looking for something to play both mid and top, she's definitely a pick. Obviously, the ban rate's pretty high, so you have to be a bit careful. I do think Aurora is pretty hard. It's definitely not the easiest champ to play. They have made her a little more difficult, where before you could just basically drop your ult on people and that was it. I think now, like, it is reliant more on, like, punishing the lane and, like, hitting more QEs and fights. You still can just pull up and drop your ult, and that's definitely useful, but there is more skill to her, I think, than the previous patch. There's a couple more I want to talk about before I go into all the tiers, and the first one is Smolder. So I've got Smolder in B tier. I'm of the opinion, though, that, like, if you're very high rank, or if you're very, very good at Smolder and his playstyle, that Smolder is probably an S tier champ. I think he's very, very broken. So last patch, you know, I was kind of looking for more AD mids to play. And if you go and look at, like, a lot of the high elo Korean mids, they have Smolder in their match history. And you can, you know, filter by Smolder, and you can see, like, it's still been played semi-recently. You can go look at them, but you'll see lots and lots of Smolder. So I was kind of curious as to why, like, Smolder was so strong, why it was getting picked. Obviously, it was after Smolder received some changes. And you guys might have seen a couple different Smolder builds going around, but the TLDR is that the thing with Smolder is if you play him really well, he is actually really, really strong in lane and probably the best AD mid blind, because, like, he can neutralize pretty much any lane. He actually just straight up wins a lot of lanes as well. And he has a dash, which is very, very, very valuable. So super, super good AD blind. And actually, I started playing a lot of them as well. So on this account, I had a lot of success with Smolder. In fact, when I got to Challenger, it was off a lot of Smolder spam on the day, and it, yeah, feels really, really strong. I played on this account as well. Definitely the win rate is not as high, though I've been recovering it a little bit lately. So I guess to get into a bit more detail about why it's strong and, like, why you might struggle with it. So Smolder is not the kind of champ where you just hit 225 and you instantly win. It's not an AFK scaler. The reason Smolder is strong is because of his acceleration. It's kind of like Rise, where, like, if you're ahead, you can very easily farm, you can take turrets, you can do jungle camps, you can get a lot of gold very, very quickly. And of course that translates into stacks. And so that means that, like, in a lot of ways, even though Smolder doesn't need to snowball, you absolutely cannot fall behind. If you fall behind, you're going to be useless. You're going to get your stacks too late. You're going to be too squishy in team fights. You won't be able to side lane. So that's what makes it difficult. It's kind of like Draven. If Draven... Actually, it is kind of like Draven in a lot of ways, except you don't necessarily, like, need to snowball so much. You just, again, you really need to not, like, die randomly. And so the difficulty of playing Smolder comes from a few things. One, most matchups require very specific responses in terms of, like, itemization that you need to go for, or runes that you need to change, ways you need to play your wave, because, like, it's really important that, like, you are always ahead. You need to always be ahead in CS, you need to be ahead in XP. And if you start falling behind, it can be really bad. And so a lot of the time when you play a matchup for the first time as Smolder, if you don't know how to play it, it's probably going to suck. So an example of this sort of matchup would be, I played it against Akali like a few days ago, somewhere down here. Yeah, I played against a Diamond 3 Akali, and I got solo killed like 3 times, and I was basically useless. Like, even though I was doing damage at the end, ultimately, like, the Akali got too strong too early. I was never able to contest her inside. You can see I only have 6.5 CSPM, and I have 10 deaths. I'm also only level 14, so, like, basically, I'm just out of the game because I fell behind, right? But yesterday, I played against an Akali, and there were a lot of adaptations I made. So, for example, I decided that instead of pushing the first 3 waves, I'd actually just pull it to me immediately. I also decided that I would go Hex Drinker before even going for Essence Reaver. You know, so it's like those sort of things where suddenly that can change the game completely, right? Like, I got kind of demolished by a Diamond 3 Akali, and here I am beating a Grandmaster Akali. And that was just because, like, now that I've played the matchup and stuff, like, I know what to do with it. And, you know, somewhat that is the case on every champ, where the first time you play a matchup, it's going to be difficult. But because you can't fall behind on Smolder, it's going to be much more punishing. You don't provide any utility, and you just can't, you know, achieve your identity if you fall behind. Another thing that kind of makes the champ difficult, or just, general things, is it's a very fundamental based champ, right? You really need to know how to side lane. You need to know, like, when you want fights, when not to. You've really got to make sure that you've got good base timing so that you're keeping, like, good uptime on the map. Obviously, positioning is quite difficult because you are still a squishy AD carry at the end of the day. So he is quite a, yeah, like I said, just an all-round. The play style of the champ is quite difficult, even if mechanically the champ is not so difficult himself. So, like I said, I think if Smolder, if you're really, really good at the play style, whatever, I think he is extremely broken. I will make a Smolder guide probably in a couple days, and I will try and talk about all the things that I've learned playing Smolder so far, what I think the best builds are, and when and why to build them, basically. So just look out for that. But I would say, unless you really desperately need an AD champ in your pool, I would actually probably stay away from it. You can use Smolder as a counter pick, and that makes it a lot easier. Like, if you do play Smolder into something like Galio, it's extremely free. It's going to be very, very easy. But if you want to be using it like as a core part of your pool and playing it into a lot of champs, definitely a lot of investment going to be needed before it works. And the last champ I'll talk about before I actually just move into the tiers is Ambessa. So Ambessa's got a really, really high win rate in mid, mainly as a counter pick to melees. I think you probably can pick it into some sort of weaker range champs, but I think it's just because the champ in general is very, very broken. And so it's kind of like, you just want to find a way to get an Ambessa on your team. And one of the ways to do it is mid lane into melees. It's kind of similar to how, like, a lot of people are playing Viktor bot right now. And it's not even so much that Viktor bot is especially OP. It's just that Viktor is really strong. And again, like, bot happens to be one of the ways you can get it. So I do think Ambessa is better in top, but like, if you want to play Ambessa mid, I think it's pretty good. Personally, have not played it, but I've watched a lot of VODs of it, and it seems very, very promising into melee champs. Okay, so we'll get into the tiers themselves. I'll quickly just explain each tier. So we've already talked about S tier and why these champs are strong, but S tier in general, these are champs that are pretty much just overtuned. You can pick them almost every game because of how strong they are, and like they're kind of like, you would even be willing to play some bad matchups on them just because of how strong they are. The A tier is, these are kind of the champs you want to be looking to play ideally. Some of them are more situational, things like Talia, Lissandra, and Ambessa are more counter picks. Some of them are definitely still solid blinds. You've got things like the Galio, the Ori, Ahri LeBlanc can be solid blinds. Some of them do gain value specifically with what they're paired with. Like Yone, for example, enabling AP junglers is very powerful. Yone blind on his own is still good, but not as good, right? So some of the power is tied to other things in the meta. But overall, like, these are kind of the champs that you would consider. I would say everything A and above is considered overtuned. Like, these are the stronger champs in the game. Once you get down to B tier, so I'd say the B tier order doesn't really matter too much. You can move these champs around basically whatever, wherever, within the tier itself. These are mostly like counter pick champions. They are pretty strong in their situations, but they kind of need some conditions to be met. Like, for example, you can play Swain into like freer melee matchups, but you don't want to play them into range matchups. Or you can play, I don't know, something like, what else could we play? We could play something like Vex into some melee champs. We could play Annie if the enemy has like immobility and you've got a ganking jungler. Like, all of these, you could argue for them to be top of B or bottom of B, just depending on like the situation you're in. But you probably don't want to be like one-tricking these champions. Actually, you can one-trick some of these champions, but as you go higher, they're not going to be the best blinds. Like, some of them will definitely struggle. If you're below like probably Diamond, I think you can definitely one-trick champs in here, maybe even below Master. But I would probably recommend champs up here if you're looking purely at power. Champs in C and D, these are champs that I'd kind of like recommend staying away from unless you get like really, really good opportunities for them. There are actually some champs down here that I think are pretty strong in the right spots. Like, I think Garen, Cho'Gath, Seraphine, like, these champs are pretty good if you get like the right conditions, but the conditions are pretty rare and like probably not really worth investing into. And I think D tier, I'd probably just stay away from. I don't think these champs are particularly strong. So since we've already talked about S tier, I'll talk about a few champs in A tier. And the first ones I want to talk about are Yone, Sylas, and Galio. So Yone, still really, really strong champion. I think that if you know what you're doing, it's quite hard to push him out of lane, especially into mages. You do need to be a little careful blinding him because there are some matchups where Yone can actually kill by himself, but he has ganks it up. And so, like, most mages, the sustain from Yone means you can, out-sustain them, but also your ganks it up means you have threat on them. If you are playing against something like Akali or LeBlanc, it can be a lot more difficult because they're not as reliant on poke, and also you don't have as much threat with ganks it up. And because you don't have a side lane win condition, you kind of just don't end up doing anything for a while. So I think that, like, even though you can blind Yone, it is better if you counterpick him, but he is very strong, and especially into, like, mage meta, he's very, very good. Definitely, though, like I said, there are a few matchups you really want to avoid. Like, I think Aurora, Akali, LeBlanc, those are probably the three worst ones. I would try to stay away from those. Sylas is maybe the greediest pick on the patch, but at the same time, like, he is so broken that he's, like, maybe not even a greedy pick anymore. So there are a few pretty rough matchups for Sylas. Like, I think LeBlanc and Zoe can both be quite hard. But overall, like Sylas has such good gank setup, and most of the champs that you would play into Sylas can be ganked. So yeah, I think Sylas is the kind of thing where you want to see either a good matchup or some good ultis, and you can lock him in. But if you get a good Sylas game, he goes really, really hard. Galio, I think Galio is really, really, really OP into mages. I do think that he... mages and assassins, actually. Anything AP, he's really good into. He can be good into AD assassins. The only real risk of Galio, as like a Galio blind, is ending up against an AD range champ. So like, for example, if you blind Galio and you end up against like Tristana, Corki, or Smolder, you kind of have to win the game in a pretty short amount of time before you get outscaled. And I do think that even though you can play AP Galio, I think the tank, variant, specifically the Hollow Radiance into Magic Resist, or into APs, is much, much better. So I think, yeah, you can blind Galio, but there's probably like one AD range champ you want to ban. If you don't run into it very often, especially in low reloads, it's probably really good. But as you get like a little bit higher, just be a little more careful with when you're picking him. You can, of course, still blind him if your team is like really good gank setup or whatever, because, it's basically always going to have a threat onto your opponent. So that's something you can factor in as well. Like if you have Jarvan or Rakan, Camille, those are good Galio angles, even if you don't necessarily end up against an AP mid. Couple other champs I want to talk about in A tier is Ahri and Akali. So I've moved Ahri down a little bit. I think she's still very good, but I think she has lost a little bit of blind pick value, and that's mainly just because, like, I think that, well, Viktor is really, really good in Ahri. You basically, like, require ganks, but he should have so much control over the lane that it's actually going to be pretty hard. Like, if he sets up his wards and stuff correctly, you're probably just going to find yourself falling pretty far behind. And even if he doesn't, like, hard shit on you in lane, he still scales way better than you, so that's a pretty scary matchup. And also, like, I think, yeah, there's like a lot of things that are difficult but playable. Yone, Sylas, LeBlanc, like, you can definitely win these matchups, but it requires some finesse. So overall, I think that I would prefer to blind, maybe the Aurora or the Viktor or something else. So because Ahri's value is tied a lot to her blind pick ability, and I think that's gone down, I do think she's, like, not as valuable. Akali, I think, really, really good at the moment. That's the other main champ I wanted to talk about here. So Akali into a lot of matchups is basically just, like... Some matchups you just get pushed in early and you never really find a way to scale, especially if, like if you mess up on your first ulti and you don't get a kill or something, you can end up just kind of getting outpaced and falling behind. But there definitely are matchups as Akali where your opponent just doesn't have the strength to trade back into you. And I'd actually say in a lot of ways, Akali, because she's so stat check heavy at the moment, she's one of the best answers to if your opponent just picks something off meta. Like if you do end up against any off meta champ, especially an off meta melee champ that just doesn't really have enough strength to get through your sustain and maybe doesn't have enough scaling to make up for it, you can just get a free win into like pretty much any B tier champ. But also it's still solid against like a lot of the A tier champs as well. So probably your premier assassin, and definitely one if you had Akali in your pool previously, now is a pretty good time to play her. Coming down on the B tier, I think everything is the same as last patch, but the one thing I want to mention is Neeko, because Bulldog, who's the rank 1 on Korea, has actually been playing like a little bit of Neeko lately, so I don't know. I think Neeko, the reason it's not played more is because it's a champ that's very, very strong early, but it definitely doesn't scale that well. And, if you don't snowball, it can be kind of difficult to get stuff done with. That being said, I think the champ is really strong. Like it's, I think, really, really annoying to play against Neeko. I think one of the champs I hate the most. And one of the really big bonuses, especially in high elo as Neeko, is his insane flex value. So Neeko can be played jungle, mid, or support. So in that sense, like if you pick Neeko, a lot of the time your opponents won't know what to pick into it, and they won't even know which lane it's going into. So I think purely for that, Neeko does have a lot of value, and you could maybe move her up to A tier. Personally, I don't actually see that much Neeko mid in my games at the moment, so it's like hard for me to rate it accurately. But it's a champ where, like, I think if you're really good at Neeko, it probably is really good. But there's so few players that I've seen actually like performing it well that I've still got it in B tier. But yeah, could definitely be worth it. Other than that, I don't really think there's anything specific I want to mention. As always, if you have any questions or anything, put them in the comments section below and I'll be happy to answer them. Or you can come to my stream and ask me there. I will be making guides on both Viktor and Smolder coming up. They'll be kind of a bit shorter than my normal full in-depth guides, but I do want to get them out before the season ends just so you guys can abuse them a little bit. Otherwise, yeah, thank you guys so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. See you guys in the next one.